History tends to feel settled, tidy, timelines, agreed facts, closed debates. But buried in the newspaper archives of the 1800s is a trail of reports that refuses to stay buried. Major American newspapers once described discoveries that directly challenge what we are taught about the human past. These were not legends passed down orally, nor stories printed in fringe pamphlets, but routine reports written in calm, factual language. Today, those same accounts are rarely discussed, quietly dismissed, or entirely unknown. The question is not whether the stories sound strange, but why so many of them exist at all, and why they vanished from mainstream history so completely. The forgotten narrative of giants. The history of North America, as it is presented in modern textbooks, is a carefully curated narrative. It is a linear story of migration, survival, and gradual development that fits neatly into the standardized models of academia. However, when one leaves the safety of the classroom and enters the digitized archives of the 19th century, that clean line begins to fracture. There is a profound rupture between the observations of early American explorers and the history accepted today. A close examination of the historical record reveals that the American frontier was far stranger and more mysterious than usually portrayed. The early chroniclers of this continent did not describe a predictable land. They described a landscape filled with anomalies that modern science has largely chosen to forget. This investigation is not built on folklore or oral tradition, but on the text of the nation's most respected journalism. During the late 1800s and early 1900s, newspapers like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the San Diego Union frequently reported on a phenomenon that has since been relegated to the fringe. These archives contain hundreds of detailed accounts regarding the discovery of human skeletal remains of extraordinary stature. These were not isolated mentions in sensationalist tabloids. These were detailed, matter-of-fact accounts published by the primary record keepers of the day. Reporters, physicians, and naturalists treated the unearthing of 7, 8, and 9-foot skeletons with remarkable seriousness. They viewed these finds not as impossibilities, but as significant pieces of natural history that demanded documentation. To understand the scale of this forgotten reality, one must look at one of the most compelling case studies from the archives. On the 4th of May, 1912, the New York Times published a report that challenges the very foundation of known bioarchaeology. The article detailed an excavation overseen by the Peterson brothers at Lake Lawn Farm in Wisconsin. The site was a complex of effigy mounds, distinct earthworks associated with the ancient woodland culture that dominated the region centuries prior. As the excavators cut into the earth, they did not uncover typical remains. Instead, they revealed a burial ground of 18 individuals whose physical dimensions defied the norms of the era. The report was clinically specific. It stated that the skeletons ranged in height from 7 feet 6 inches to an astounding 10 feet. To put that in perspective, a 10-foot human frame is nearly double the average height of a person from that time period. But the size was only the beginning of the anomaly. The New York Times described skulls that were presumably those of men, yet they were much larger than the heads of any race inhabiting America. The anatomy was described as freakish. The skulls sloped straight back from the eye sockets, suggesting a distinct cranial morphology or artificial deformation. The nasal bones protruded significantly above the cheekbones, creating a facial profile that diverged sharply from the known features of Native American populations. The jawbones were long and pointed, further distinguishing these remains from the standard anatomical record. The tone of the article was not one of disbelief, but of discovery. The reporter noted these features as objective facts, expecting that the Wisconsin Historical Museum would investigate further. Yet, looking back from the present day, there is a conspicuous silence. These discoveries, along with hundreds of others like them, faded from public view. They were not debunked so much as they were ignored. The disappearance of this data suggests a systematic exclusion, a pruning of the archaeological record to facilitate the construction of a more manageable historical framework. The public is left with a void where museum displays should be. By ignoring these anomalies, the academic world may have erased a crucial chapter of the human story on this continent, a pattern across the decades. If we were looking at a single article from a small-town tabloid, it would be easy to dismiss the entire idea of giant skeletons as a hoax or a misunderstanding. One reporter could be prone to exaggeration, or one local legend could spiral out of control. But we are not looking at a single incident. When you zoom out and examine the archives of the late 19th century, a different picture emerges. We see a consistent, repetitive pattern of discovery that spans decades and stretches across the entire North American continent. These accounts were not restricted to the fringe. They appeared in the most respected broadsheets of the day, reported with the same dry, bureaucratic detail as a crop report or a town council meeting. Consider the report from the Indianapolis News in 1879. The paper documented the unearthing of a skeleton in Indiana that measured 8 feet in height. What makes this account particularly striking is the description of the skull, which the report noted was twice the size of a normal human's. This was not a vague estimation. It was a specific comparison made by those who handled the remains. Jump forward 14 years to 1893, and the Washington Post, one of the nation's papers of record, detailed a similar discovery in Minnesota. In this case, the large remains were found alongside copper artifacts. This detail is crucial because it links the physical stature of the individual to a high level of technological sophistication. These were not primitive outliers. The presence of refined copper tools suggests this individual held a place of prominence in a complex society. 2 years later, in 1895, the San Diego Union reported on an 8-foot skeleton found on the California coast. From the Midwest to the Pacific, the descriptions remain hauntingly similar. We see the same height ranges, the same massive cranial features, and the same association with ancient, high-status burial mounds. The uniformity of these reports across such a vast distance suggests that these reporters were documenting a real physical phenomenon rather than engaging in a nationwide creative writing exercise. Modern critics often try to explain these finds away by claiming that settlers were simply digging up mastodon bones and mistaking them for humans. They argue that the average 19th century farmer or laborer was uneducated and easily confused by animal remains. But think about that for a second. Life in the 1800s was visceral and close to the earth. The average citizen was far more familiar with death and anatomy than the average person is today. Most people in this era prepared their own dead for burial in the parlor. They butchered their own livestock. A farmer who spent his life working with animals knew exactly what a cow femur or a mastodon bone looked like. It is historically unlikely that hundreds of people across the country, including local physicians and naturalists, would consistently mistake the thick, pillar-like leg bone of a prehistoric elephant for the distinct bipedal anatomy of a human being. When a report specifies a height of 7 feet 4 inches, rather than a round number like 10 feet, it indicates a level of measurement and observation that is inconsistent with a complete fabrication or a gross misidentification. The most convincing aspect of these reports is actually their tone. They do not read like ghost stories or tall tales. The journalists described the context of the burial with the same level of detail as the bones themselves. They documented the layers of charcoal, the presence of ash, and the texture of the bark wrappings used as burial shrouds. This mundane, matter-of-fact reporting style lends a significant amount of credibility to the observations. The writers were not trying to convince the reader of a fantasy. They were simply reporting the news of the day. The existence of large-statured individuals was accepted as a fact of the local history, a physical reality that was only later deemed impossible when the academic frameworks of the 20th century hardened into a rigid narrative. The geography of the giants. When researchers compile the hundreds of isolated newspaper reports regarding giant skeletons into a single database, a striking visual pattern begins to emerge. These discoveries were not scattered randomly across the North American continent like buckshot. Instead, They appear in tight, specific clusters that correspond almost perfectly with the most significant archaeological zones of the ancient world. If one were to place a pin on a map for every reported find of a human skeleton over 7 feet tall between 1850 and 1920, the resulting image would outline the great river systems of the East. The Ohio River Valley, the Mississippi River Basin, and the Great Lakes region light up with concentrations of these anomalies. This geographical clustering offers a profound insight. It suggests that the phenomenon of the tall ones was not a collection of tall tales, but a biological reality tied to specific cultures and environments. This distribution provides a roadmap of what might be termed the megalithic landscape of ancient America. The areas with the highest density of giant reports are the exact same regions dominated by the Adena and Hopewell cultures. These were the mound builders, the societies responsible for the massive earthen pyramids, geometric enclosures, and complex ceremonial centers that still dot the landscape today. The correlation between the giant skeletons and these earthworks is too precise to be coincidental. It implies that the individuals of extraordinary stature found within these mounds were not outliers or social outcasts. They were the architects, the high priests, or the ruling aristocracy of the civilizations that built them. In many ancient societies, the ruling elite were significantly taller than the common populace, a result of better access to nutrition and perhaps selective lineage. The archaeological context here suggests a similar structure, where a distinct, robust subpopulation presided over the construction of these monumental earthworks. The evidence for this link is preserved in some of the most official documents of early American archaeology. In the Kanawha Valley of West Virginia, a region rich in burial mounds, the 12th annual report of the Bureau of Ethnology recorded a discovery that aligns perfectly with this theory. The report details the excavation of a timber vault deep within a mound. Inside, agents found a skeleton measuring fully 7 feet in length. The remains were not thrown into a pit, but were carefully wrapped in bark and placed in a constructed vault, indicating a burial of immense respect and high status. This was a person of significance, literally and figuratively, enshrined in the center of the community's sacred architecture. Similar accounts appear in reports from Florida, where Smithsonian agents documented a skeleton measured at quite 7 feet before the ancient bones crumbled upon exposure to the humid air. These were not rumors from the town square. They were observations made by government-funded field agents working in the heart of the mound builder territory. However, this phenomenon was not strictly limited to the river valleys of the East. A second, equally intriguing cluster appears on the distinct maritime landscape of the California Channel Islands. In the early 20th century, amateur archaeologist Ralph Glidden conducted extensive excavations on Catalina and San Nicolas Islands. His journals and photographic records describe unearthing thousands of skeletons from the island's sandy soil. Among this vast necropolis, Glidden reported a startling frequency of immense stature. He documented many males averaging around 7 feet in height, with some individuals reaching well beyond that mark. The Channel Islands discoveries introduce a fascinating variable to the investigation. Unlike the agricultural societies of the Ohio Valley, these were maritime people. Their diet would have been rich in marine proteins, a factor that historically contributes to greater physical growth. Yet, diet alone rarely accounts for a population consistently producing individuals of such extreme size. The concentration of these tall ancestors on a chain of islands suggests the possibility of a genetic pocket, a lineage of island royalty that maintained its distinct physical traits through isolation and selective marriage. Whether in the fertile valleys of the Mississippi or the rocky coasts of Catalina, the data points to the same conclusion. The giants were not monsters of myth, but a biological class of people who walked the earth, ruled these ancient societies, and were buried with the honors befitting kings. Anatomy versus the assumption. The standard academic response to the hundreds of 19th century reports describing giant skeletons is almost always the same. Skeptics and modern scholars frequently categorize these finds as misidentifications of extinct megafauna. The argument is that early settlers, unfamiliar with the fossil record, would dig up the femur of a mastodon or the rib of a prehistoric elk and mistakenly identify it as the bone of a giant human. While it is true that such mistakes happened, this explanation fails to account for the anatomical specificity found in the vast majority of the reports. A mastodon leg bone is a massive, pillar-like structure designed to support tons of weight. It bears little resemblance to the distinct, bipedal anatomy of a human femur. When a report explicitly states that a skeleton measured 7 feet 6 inches, or that the thigh bones were full 6 inches longer than those of any man in the county, it implies a direct, side-by-side comparison that would be impossible if the observer were looking at the remains of an elephant. The observers of the 19th century were often more clinically astute than they are given credit for. Many reports describe specific cranial features that are uniquely human. For instance, several accounts mention an abnormal enlargement of the sella turcica, the cavity in the skull that holds the pituitary gland. This is a precise diagnostic sign of pituitary gigantism, a known medical condition that leads to excessive height. Identifying such a specific internal structure requires a close examination of a human skull. It is highly improbable that a farmer or a country doctor would mistake a piece of megafauna rubble for a human skull base and then correctly identify a pituitary abnormality within it. One of the most frequently ridiculed details in these archival reports is the description of double rows of teeth. To the modern ear, this sounds like the stuff of folklore or monsters, leading many to dismiss the accounts entirely. However, bioarchaeology offers a nuanced explanation that grounds this description in reality. In the 19th century, the term double teeth was often used to describe molars. When reports mention double teeth all around, they are likely describing a condition of extreme dental attrition. The diets of ancient populations were often full of grit from stone-ground meal, which would wear down the front incisors until they were flat and broad, resembling molars. Alternatively, this could be a reference to hyperdontia, a medical condition where supernumerary or extra teeth develop in the mouth. Hyperdontia is genetic and often occurs in clusters within populations that have a limited gene pool. If the giants found in the mounds represented a ruling elite that practiced endogamy or intermarriage to maintain their royal lineage, a high frequency of hyperdontia would be a predictable genetic result. Thus, when early explorers reported double rows of teeth, they were not describing a monster. They were likely documenting a genetic trait of a specific, isolated subpopulation. The sheer scale of these individuals is perhaps best illustrated by the recurring motif of the jawbone test. Throughout the archives, there are numerous accounts of a discoverer picking up a recovered mandible and slipping it easily over his own face. This is a visceral, physical measurement that conveys the size of the remains better than any numerical data. For a human jawbone to fit over the flesh, beard, and jaw of a living, robust man, the original owner would need to possess a skull of massive proportions. This fits with reports describing skulls as big as a peck basket or large enough to be used as a helmet. These descriptions suggest that the reported giants were not merely tall, thin individuals stretched by growth disorders, but were proportionally robust, with heavy skeletal structures built to support significant musculature and mass. When one moves past the reflex to dismiss these accounts as myths, the anatomical details present a picture of a biological reality that is difficult to explain away. The Smithsonian's buried evidence. The most contentious aspect of the giant skeleton narrative does not come from small-town newspapers or local legends. It comes from the archives of the Smithsonian Institution itself. For decades, the standard response to inquiries about these remains has been a firm denial, a claim that the records do not exist or that the specimens were never received. However, when we stop relying on external reports and start reading the institution's own internal documentation from the late 19th century, a different story emerges. The smoking gun is not a rumor. It is the 12th annual report of the Bureau of Ethnology, published between 1890 and 1891. This massive volume was authored under the direction of Cyrus Thomas, the man tasked with solving the mystery of the mounds. In the dry, bureaucratic language of a federal report, Thomas and his field agents admitted to unearthing skeletal remains that defy the modern textbook standard. In the Kanawha Valley of West Virginia, specifically in Mound 11, the report records the discovery of a skeleton measuring 7.5 feet in length and 19 inches across the shoulders. This individual was found deep within the earth, lying in a bark coffin, suggesting a burial of immense significance. The report continues to detail similar finds in Roane County, Tennessee, where a skeleton between 7 and 8 feet tall was found buried at full length. In Joe DeVias County, Illinois, the agents noted a burial of gigantic stature found in a sitting posture. In Florida, Smithsonian agents measured a skeleton as quite 7 feet before the bones crumbled upon exposure to the air. Perhaps the most startling admission appears in the Smithsonian Annual Report of 1873. It documents the discovery of a skull in Anna, Illinois, with a circumference of 36 inches. To put that in perspective, the average human head has a circumference of roughly 22 inches. A 36-inch skull is nearly double the size of a normal cranium, a measurement that is physically impossible for a human being as we currently understand our biology. These are not the ravings of conspiracy theorists. These are data points entered into the official scientific record by the very institution that now claims they do not exist. The question then becomes one of motive. Why would the Smithsonian actively work to erase evidence that they themselves collected? The answer lies in the political and academic climate of the late 19th century. Under the leadership of Major John Wesley Powell, who was appointed director in 1879, the institution adopted a policy that has been described as manifest destiny archaeology. Powell was determined to debunk the mound builder myth, which was the popular idea that a lost, non-native race had constructed the massive earthworks of North America. Powell empowered Cyrus Thomas to prove once and for all that the mounds were the work of the ancestors of modern Native Americans. This conclusion was scientifically sound and politically necessary, as it integrated the indigenous history of the continent into a manageable, linear narrative. However, the push for a standardized history led to the pruning of any data that did not fit the new model. The giant skeletons were a problem. They had long been used by amateur theorists to support the idea of a lost race of superiors. To Powell and Thomas, these anomalous remains were noise in the dataset. They were inconvenient outliers that threatened to muddy the water of their primary objective. If the mounds were to be reclaimed for native history, the giants had to be removed from the equation. The erasure was likely not a dramatic destruction of evidence, but a bureaucratic reclassification. The hundreds of 7- and 8-foot skeletons sent to the museum were simply labeled as pathological or abnormal. They were crated up, moved to restricted access storage rooms, and effectively buried in the archives. Over the decades, as the staff turned over and the catalogs were modernized, these crates were forgotten. This was not necessarily a conspiracy of malice, but a deliberate decision to exclude anomalous data to ensure the survival of a preferred historical paradigm. The bones are likely still there, gathering dust in the deep storage of the Museum Support Center, waiting for a generation of researchers brave enough to open the box. The professionalization of silence. The reporting of giant skeletons in North America follows a distinct chronological arc that tells a story all its own. If one were to graph the frequency of these newspaper accounts, the line would rise steadily through the mid-19th century, peaking in the 1880s and 1890s. Then, as the new century turns, the line begins to plummet. By 1920, the reports effectively vanish. This abrupt decline is often cited by skeptics as proof that the phenomenon was merely a fad, a product of Victorian sensationalism that died out as the public became more educated. However, a closer look at the history of science reveals a different cause. This timeline of silence corresponds precisely with the professionalization of archaeology and anthropology in the United States. During the golden age of amateur archaeology, roughly between 1850 and 1900, the exploration of the past was a democratic pursuit. There were no distinct barriers between the professional and the public. Local explorers, country physicians, and naturalists were the primary excavators of the American frontier. When these men dug into a mound and found a skeleton measuring 8 feet in length, they reported it to the local historical society or newspaper without hesitation. They had no tenure to lose, no grant funding to secure, and no academic reputation to protect. They were simply observers recording the physical reality of what they found in the earth. Because there was no centralized authority to dictate what was biologically possible, these observers were free to report anomalies as news. As the 20th century dawned, the landscape changed dramatically. Archaeology shifted from an amateur pastime to a rigid academic discipline housed within universities and government institutions. This transition brought with it the need for a standardized historical framework, a clean and linear narrative that could be taught in classrooms and printed in textbooks. In this new environment, physical anomalies like giant skeletons became liabilities. They did not fit the model. The open curiosity of the 19th century was replaced by a clinical gatekeeping that sought to filter out anything that challenged the established norms. The figure most responsible for enforcing this new discipline was Alois Hrdlicka. As the curator of physical anthropology at the Smithsonian Institution in the early 1900s, Hrdlicka was a fierce guardian of the scientific status quo. He was notoriously skeptical of any claims regarding the antiquity of humans in the Americas, and he harbored a particular disdain for reports of abnormal stature. Hrdlicka viewed the amateur accounts of giants not as data, but as the product of what he called the will to believe. He waged a career-long war against these anomalies, frequently dismissing them as hoaxes or misidentifications without ever visiting the sites. Hrdlicka's influence created a culture of skepticism that permeated the entire field. He established a precedent where reporting a giant was no longer a path to discovery, but a guarantee of professional ridicule. Under his watch, the mechanism of erasure was perfected. It was not necessarily a conspiracy of destruction, but a shift in incentives. If an aspiring archaeologist in 1920 wanted to build a career, they learned very quickly to ignore the 7-foot skeleton and focus on the pottery shards that fit the approved timeline. We effectively traded the raw, unfiltered observation of the frontier for the safety of a theoretical model. The giants did not necessarily disappear from the earth in 1920. The permission to see them simply expired. The giants beneath our feet. When we step back and view the entirety of this investigation, the sheer weight of the evidence becomes impossible to ignore. We are not dealing with a handful of isolated rumors or a few eccentric hoaxes. We are confronting a database of over 300 independent reports spanning nearly a century of American history. To dismiss this volume of consistent, detailed testimony as nothing more than mass hysteria or collective incompetence is to deny the basic competency of the people who built this nation. The farmers, physicians, and journalists of the 19th century were observers of the natural world, and they recorded what they saw with a clarity that demands our respect. This erasure forces us to confront a difficult truth about the nature of history itself. History is not merely a fixed collection of facts waiting to be memorized. It is a constructed narrative, a story we curate to explain how we arrived at the present. In the early 20th century, the academic world decided on a specific version of that story. It was a narrative of linear progression, a safe and predictable timeline that moved from primitive to modern without deviation. The existence of a technologically advanced, physically superior race of giants did not fit into this new box. It was a variable that made the equation too complex. So, rather than rewriting the history books, the institution simply pruned the anomaly from the tree. Most of the physical evidence is now gone. The skeletons sent to museums have been reclassified, lost in the labyrinth of storage, or returned to the earth. Yet, What remains is a mystic record that cannot be so easily destroyed. The paper trail found in the archives of the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the local gazettes of the frontier stands as a stubborn testament to a lost reality. These documents are the ghosts of a forgotten chapter, whispering a truth that modern science has tried to silence. They remind us that the past is far stranger and more diverse than we are often led to believe. The case of the living giants serves as a profound cautionary tale. If a physical reality as undeniable as a 9-foot human skeleton can be removed from our collective consciousness in less than 100 years, we must ask ourselves, what else has been sanitized for the sake of institutional convenience? How many other chapters of the human story have been edited out because they were too challenging, too mysterious, or too difficult to explain? The giants of old are still there, sleeping beneath the cornfields of the Midwest and the mounds of the Ohio Valley. They are ignored by the textbooks and dismissed by the scholars, but they are remembered by the earth itself. The truth is not always found in the lecture hall. Sometimes it is found in the yellowed pages of a forgotten newspaper or the quiet silence of an ancient burial ground. We must remain curious, skeptical of the official narrative, and willing to look into the shadows of the archives. The history of this continent is vast, deep, and waiting to be rediscovered. Keep digging.